Thank you. My name's Amanda and I'm codependent. Oh, it's lovely to be here and it's lovely to see some faces on screen. As a codependent, it makes such a difference when you can see faces. Um, and it's a privilege to come back here. I did come and do a talk a couple of years ago here, and I really appreciate everything the Arizona group has done for CoDA and the workshops and all the time and love and effort that goes into organizing the events. And I'm so grateful to be asked again, and I'm so grateful that I stayed in CoDA to receive many of the promises that are present in our fellowship. And I chose peeling back the layers of the abandoned wound because of how much this has influenced my life and how much of a journey it's been for me whilst being in CoDA, starting to understand what happened to me as a little girl and how that affected me growing up and how it affected my relationship with myself and every other relationship in my life from that, and the distortions that the disease did within my family and within myself that I never really understood about what life should be like or what healthy relationships are. I never understood that. And the abandonment wound for me was, I wasn't aware of it as a child. And I think one of the main symptoms of my traumatic childhood was my lack of memories. I didn't have any memories as a child. I had very little memories of my early childhood. And I used to have a few memories. I remembered that when my mum used to come and sit on the end of my bed, I would do this tunnel vision. And I think now that was most probably because of what I experience of her. She's verbally abusive. She's an alcoholic, and what I know is that since I've been coming here, my identification and my connection with my little girl has become so real and present now that when I think of me as a little girl, I have so much sadness in my heart around what happened to me and that connection of the journey that it's taken to feel that within this fellowship. I've been coming to CoDA I'm in my 13th year, and I've done a lot of step work, and the abandonment wound was the thing that I saw, especially in that first step 4, that sat under every relationship when I arrived here, and all my relationships throughout my life. I really understood that my abandonment was the way I set up every relationship. It was the thing that manifested all my codependent behaviors. My lack of being able to speak my truth was all around my abandonment, because I thought everybody was going to leave me. If I rocked the boat, if I spoke my truth, if I said I was upset with you, or if I said I didn't like the way you said that, I was convinced you were going to leave me. And I think that's why choosing this topic is so relevant, because as time has gone on and the more I've done the step work in CoDA, the more I feel freer from the effect of that wound and the old worn out behaviors that I used in my life because of that wound. And I came to CoDA when I was 10 years in recovery in another fellowship, and I was almost at the point of breakdown because of being so codependent, and having another 12-step program fuel my codependency for 10 years and not knowing what it was and not understanding what it was. And when I came here, it was about going on this journey. I wanted to know why I had this thing in relationships that when they broke down, I'd want to die, I'd want to kill myself. It wasn't just like, oh, I felt a bit rough or I felt upset or a bit depressed. It was like I really couldn't manage life. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep, I couldn't take care of myself. There was such a physical reaction to the end of relationships, and that occurred from the moment that I stopped using drugs and alcohol, really, every relationship I went into was accompanied by this underlying fear that it was going to end. And how it also presented with me was with lots of sabotaging behaviors. I could not maintain intimacy. I had this element that was constantly trying to sabotage. I would draw people in and then I would push them away. And it was all about that abandonment. I was like pushing people to see if they were going to leave me. And that was very, even though I could see that I did this pattern, it was like a uncontrollable reflex in me that if anyone got too close, I would start pushing them away. And my behavior was a very switchy, and I didn't really know myself. My moods were very out of control as well. I was very, very moody and not really, I didn't know myself, but I just knew that I couldn't maintain healthy relationships at all. And actually what I kept doing was just drawing people in. And it was always about attention. It was always about feeling loved. I just wanted someone to see me and love me. And I was so lacking in self-esteem. And I was so full of self-hatred. Those were the other symptoms. So full of self-hatred and so uncomfortable in my own skin. And this pain that just didn't want to go anywhere. And actually the more time I had in this other fellowship, the more the pain increased. So it was like the first relationship I went in, I think it took me about a year to get over that end of that relationship. And then every time I came out of a relationship, I'd hit this pain. And no one told me what it was. No one spoke about it in the other fellowship. And then I used to come to CoDA and I'd just come in with snot coming out of my nose, but I didn't. And I'd hear you guys and I'd be really upset. And yet I never went away and did the step work. And it wasn't until I was 10 years clean that I came here and actually was in enough pain and enough chaos in my life that I knew I had to make a change. And I knew I had to go on a journey to find out why and where this pain came from. And that was when I came to CoDA and I really started to acknowledge that I needed to do the program. I needed to do the step work. I needed to get involved with this fellowship. And I needed to put down all the caretaking behavior, because that was my avoidance, and my denial was all about filling my attention and my headspace with looking after other people. And it was what I'd done from an early age. You know, I came from a family where I had a disabled sister. My little sister had spina bifida and hydrocephalus, and my mum was a heavy drinker, and my stepfather was a heavy drinker, and my father was a heavy drinker. So I was brought up in family systems where alcohol was very present. And I really understand today that I was, you know, alcoholism really robbed me of my mum, robbed me of the qualities that I, you know, as a little girl, I really needed to be loved and seen and affirmed and valued and held and stroked and being told I was beautiful. And, you know, I really, really feel that, you know, that through her addiction I didn't have that parenting, you know. And that's you know, and I didn't have my father left. They had a very volatile relationship. My first memories that I do remember as a child was sitting at the top of the stairs, listening to them rowing, listening to things being thrown, listening to volatile arguments. My mum's very, very controlling and dominant. And my sister and I would sit at the top of the stairs listening, and then we'd come down in the morning. And in true sort of alcoholic home, nothing would get spoken about the night before. And I never really understood that how much I was robbed of the love that I needed as a little girl, you know. And as a result of that, I think I always wanted to be seen. I always wanted to be loved. And the reality is that because of that, you know, I just, the inner critic was born. The inner critic was born through that lack of love and trying to get their attention. You know, the voice started in the head of not being pretty, not being lovable, not being enough. And the core beliefs, those negative core beliefs, were sown as a child around who I was. And I know that even in and I was used as a weapon very much with my families, because they didn't speak, my mum and dad, when they split up. And I had my hair cut by my grandmother, and it was cut very short, and that increased my self-loathing. And as I became a teenager, though, that feeling of self-hatred just increased. And you know, and I had many relationships that were just unhealthy. I could never ask for my needs to be met. I didn't really know who I was. And when I came to this fellowship and I started doing my relationship inventory around all the relationships in my life, what I realized was that underneath all of those relationships, there was this fear of abandonment. And it was the thing that sat underneath and where everything sprung from. And I realized very early on in CoDA that that's somehow I needed to do the healing on that little girl. And I think the first step forward I did, you know, I realized that the relationships were so filled with fear. Every relationship I had, I was filled with fear, and I was trying to be the good girlfriend, the good partner, the good everything. You know, it was like the perfect partner, the perfect girlfriend, the perfect daughter, you know. And it was just this thing of perfection that had been with me throughout my life, and caretaking others. And I didn't really know how to get better. I heard people in the fellowship talking about their childhood, and that felt a relief. And as soon as I started coming here, I started experiencing memories coming back as a child, understanding that a lot of my memories had been, there was a lot of denial around what had happened to me. I you know, outwardly my home had looked really a beautiful home. I was privately educated. Externally, I was dressed beautifully, I looked well as a child. But it was like growing up in the wilderness. There was no love. It was barren. It was absolutely filled with just there was no guidance on who I was, on how to manage emotions. I couldn't express emotions. And even to this day, it's taken me many years in recovery to get in touch with sadness and to acknowledge and to let, you know, many years in recovery to let the tears come out, because there was nowhere, there was nowhere where I was seen or allowed to have those emotions present. Um, and you know, and I've learned through this program and through researching and reading books that people suggested in CoDA that you know, that there was a splitting off from my true self as a little girl through that, what happened to me, that lack of love, being a middle class child put in a bedroom and left. And that was my reality. My little sister was put into a home, and I was left in the bedroom, and my stepfather and my mother lived in the lounge, and that was a no-go area for me. So I spent most of my childhood in my head trying to work out how I could get their love. And I really understand today that the damage that was done through that neglect was the beginning of my codependency, was the beginning of the neural pathways of not feeling good enough, of always being small in my life, not having a voice, going into relationship with as a needless, wantless being. And you know, and I'm so grateful for CoDA to come here to unravel. You know, it was like having a big ball of wool of trying to work out where this end came from, where all these behaviors came from, these unhealthy behaviors of looking after others or controlling people to try and make myself feel safe. You know, and I didn't want to be that person anymore. I came here and I diligently got into a step group, and I did all the steps in the first year. I did a step a month, and And the step 4 was the beginning of me seeing that wound. And it was the first time that I understood. I didn't understand the intricacies of the damage, how it had affected my low self-esteem. Oh, I didn't have self-esteem, you know, it was like, it was totally non-existent. And then I went on a journey to find out about codependency, and I read every book I could around codependency. I watched YouTube videos from the lady who discovered codependency. You know, I went to listen to Ken and Mary. I did, you know, I just went on this complete journey of discovery through this fellowship. And it enabled me to start to unravel the past and start to put back the pieces of my past together. I started engaging in a relationship with my father, and asking him questions around my childhood, and asking my mum questions around my childhood, and that was also as well where I really started to understand that their differing views were completely differing. You know, they had completely different stories, and that enabled me, somewhere in the middle I knew was the truth of what happens. And I feel now this beautiful sense of wholeness within myself, because of coming here and many years of using people. People were my plasters, you know, my addiction to people and using human beings to cover up my pain was what my codependency was about. It was about, I didn't feel enough, but if I had you, then I felt okay. I felt whole. And I remember my meeting my partner that I have now, and I used to say, you know, I'm nothing without you, and you know, without you I'd be nothing. Or you know, all these statements that were just such codependent statements. And I went into that relationship and did my normal pattern of enmeshment and then control, and you know, and it was by the time I came to this fellowship, you know, that relationship was in the beginning of breakdown, because I'd just become so controlling and very dominant and very I needed to be in charge. That's been one of my ways of making myself feel safe in relationships. Feeling safe in life actually is just being in charge of situations, and being in charge of my emotions, and keeping emotions down and pushed down by controlling and avoiding. You know, I think my codependency more than anything has just been about avoidance of going in here, moving into this heart space, moving into the journey, which was to go in and make friends with myself, and never being taught how to do that, never being taught how to connect with another human being, because of not having that with my mother and or my father. I think the human being I most connected with was my little sister. We had a sense of connection when we grew up, and that was incredibly intense and very and we almost parented each other actually. That was where I felt my first experience of unconditional love. And even my mum today, you know, it's, if I'm not looking perfect, if I haven't got my makeup on, she'll make comments like, oh, you put a bit of weight on, or you know, and it's just this perfectionism, this sort of shiny front door. It's like, you look good, everything's okay. If you look okay, everything's okay. And I've learned through this journey in this fellowship that actually how I look is not an important factor. I don't really have a thing about coming to meetings and putting on makeup or looking okay anymore, because for me it's just part of the mask that I had in my codependency, and trying to cover up the real me that I always felt would be rejected for being me. And what's been beautiful about the CoDA journey is that don't have that self-rejection anymore, you know. And through lots of work and lots of step 4s and lots of inventories, you know, I step 10 has been the main thing that has really supported me in my CoDA recovery, to just be able to look at my patterns of when I'm back into that disease thinking, and how much it can affect me. And I really understand also that you know, that I am a totally imperfect, damaged human being from my past. But in CoDA, I've really managed to put parts of myself back together and piece myself and love myself for who I am, and not be under that sort of brutal self-critic that used to destroy me so much and tell me I wasn't worthy, I wasn't lovable. And I've recovered from a lot of that. You know, I went into battle with the inner critic. I really understood that, you know, through that abandonment, the inner critic was born. And if I wasn't going to go into battle with that voice in my head, it was going to carry on ruling my life. And I don't have it today. I don't have that voice saying, "You're ugly, Amanda. You're not lovable." You know, the voice has changed, and I've learned to parent myself. I've learned to stand in the truth that I'm lovable, that I deserve love, that I have lots of opportunity for healing as long as I stay doing the work in this fellowship. And the abandonment wound, you know, for me, it was there were many points, you know, many relationships that I could never get out of. I always felt incredibly trapped and never had the power to walk away from relationships because of how that abandonment wound affected me. And, you know, and in the relationship I was in, you know, the codependent behavior was still present, but I managed to keep a handle on it. But what I couldn't do was I couldn't leave. I knew that I was unhappy in that relationship, and I kept trying to voice my needs, and I kept trying to leave this relationship, and I couldn't do it, you know, and I tried 2 or 3 attempts to walk away from that relationship, and it just wasn't possible because every time I did it, the suicidal ideation would come up, and I'd feel like I'm not capable, I can't manage this physically. And that abandonment wound held me really in you know, I gave it so much power. I really didn't understand that you know, that I could get free, that I could actually that I could survive ending the relationship. And and it felt like this jumping off a cliff, that I would never do it. It was this thing that I always wanted to do in recovery, and I just never believed I'd have enough power or enough belief in the program or enough belief in my CoDA recovery to be able to walk away. And then what happened was, I was away with my partner, and we'd had a really difficult time. And I went on this retreat, and a few people on this retreat I talked about the relationship, and I made the decision to walk away from this relationship. And I came back, and it felt like I was doing something that I felt like I was jumping off a cliff, and there would be nothing to catch me. And what happened was I let go, and I didn't, for the first time in my life, I didn't experience that abandonment trauma that I'd experienced throughout my life. I didn't want to kill myself. I managed to eat. I managed to feed myself every day. I managed to maintain sleeping. All these things that I'd experienced throughout my life had stopped happening. And I believe that's testament to the work that I've put into CoDA, that wound to a degree had healed up through learning to love myself, through starting to parent myself, for starting to do that journey with little Amanda. Things had shifted, things had changed, and that fear that I had around my abandonment wound had sort of had the fear was bigger than actually what had happened. What I didn't realize was that during that time in CoDA, the wound had started to heal. The completion, the authenticity, that feeling of loving myself and starting to move within and not be alone anymore, you know. And part of that had been doing that inner work, spending time with my little girl. I do a meditation most mornings where I go back in to to the house that I was brought up in, and I walk up the stairs, and I come to that place on the top of the stairs, and my little sister's there. She passed away about 12 years ago. She's normally sitting at the top of the stairs, and I give her a big cuddle. And then I go through to the bedroom that I was brought up in, the bedroom that I spent most of my childhood alone in. And little me is on the bed in there, and she runs towards me now. You know, when I first started practicing inner child meditations, she wouldn't even turn towards me. I'd have to go and hug her and talk to her, and she was very avoidant. And now she runs towards me in the room and jumps into my arms. And then I bring in my partner's inner child, and I bring in my mum's inner child, and I bring in my dad's inner child, and I get my two grannies in that were also alcoholics, and I have them all in this room together, and that's really beautiful for me, because I had so much rage on this journey. I've never in you know I think I never imagined how much anger was inside my soul from what happened to me as a little girl. And through the time I've been in CoDA, that rage has dominated my personality, because it's been the emotion that I've been really easy to do. Rage has been easy for me to access. And and also anger at my parents. I still have dealings with both my alcoholic parents, and they're both very neglectful, very selfish. They're most probably narcissists, I would say. And managing those relationships has been most probably the most difficult part of my recovery. But I've really wanted to get to that place of forgiveness, and I never thought I would, especially with my mum. And because she's so cruel and such a verbal abuser, and does still, I don't let her, the cycle of abuse that came from being in that family as a child, and this stuff that went on to happen to me in active addiction, and stuff I allowed to happen, my family was the beginning of that, me allowing abuse into my life. And the beautiful thing about CoDA is, since being in this program, I have no abusive people in my life, and when my mum does try to abuse me, verbally or in any form, it's always verbal, then I just don't let it happen. I say, no, I'm not accepting that. I'll walk out of a house, I'll say I'm leaving now, or I'll put the phone down, or and I'll stand up for myself. And I did a few years ago, I did say to her, I sat her down, I'd been away for 6 months, and I'd been dreaming about my child, my little girl, and the conversation I needed to have with my mum was to say, what happened was not okay. What happened to me as a child was not okay. And I did it when she wasn't drinking. I did it on an afternoon when we were having tea, and she was in quite a good mood. And that's the journey here. That's the journey that's helped me heal that wound, to know that I stand up for my little Amanda that took so much neglect, that and that was the other thing for me, not coming here. And I'd minimize. I didn't think being neglected was that bad. And what I realized, due to the level of self-hatred, the level of trauma I experienced coming out of relationships, that what happened to me was massive. The damage that was done to me by being brought up in that a house where addiction was present was the most damaging thing in terms of my personality. And what is beautiful about being in the CoDA program is that I feel like all those parts of myself that I lost as a little girl have come back. And I have a sense of wholeness. I have a sense of authenticity within myself. I have a sense of belonging in the world. And I have a sense of that I'm not abandoning myself anymore. I stand in my truth. I don't allow myself to be abused. And the abandonment wound still will show up in different areas. I'm still, when I'm, I've been on quite a few committees, Zoom committees, through the pandemic, and I found even in relation to service, I can find my abandonment wound will come out when it comes to rescuing people that I feel are, my abandonment wound can play things out so that I feel like people are being ostracized or not being fairly treated. So the my abandonment wound still, there's still a leakage. You know, it's not like it's completely gone. It will always be part of me. But I have enough awareness today, and because I use the steps in my life, and my CoDA Step 10 has been such a beautiful part of my journey to practice self-care every day, to ensure that I'm speaking my truth, to make sure that I don't have diseased thinking in my relationship. You know, I did get back with my partner. We rebuilt the relationship, and we've gone into another fellowship together as a couple. You know, and I believe the journey of self-love has been my healing piece. You know, to all those years of neglecting and hating myself and not knowing how to love myself. Now I've become, because of CoDA, that thing of knowing that actually just turning up for myself, just speaking up in conversations. You know, my mum is still a really big part of you know, my story. Even today we had a conversation this morning, and she does this thing where she promises things and then she doesn't turn up with them, and she did that today. She she'd been promising something, and then today she sort of said she's doing something different. And I've learned not to I've learned to expect that with my mum. I don't go into denial anymore, or this fantasy that my mum's just going to turn into this lovely, beautiful mum. You know, that I had that for years, this fantasy in CoDA that at some point my mum was going to turn into this lovely mum. And I've learned how to keep myself safe from her and not give her intimate details. And I've learned to stand up and say when things aren't fair and not get in the ring. You know, my codependency wants to control anything that I feel fearful of, and I feel a lot more, I feel like I've let go a lot more. I'm a lot more in faith than I've ever been. And that was the thing as well with my codependency, that my control was so big in all areas of my life. And I feel today that I don't have to do that. And the energy of letting go and not being in the controlling, the fear and in the control all the time, has made such a difference in my recovery. And you know, and I have a really beautiful life where I feel um, that all the CoDA promises, you know, I have really equal relationships in my life. I don't have one-way relationships anymore. I'm not the rock that looks after all those other people. I can ask for help. That self-sufficiency that I had when I got here, where I never really shared anything real with people. I never shared that I needed help. It was something that was so ingrained in me, and now I do that. And you know, and I'm so glad that I stayed. I'm so glad that I stayed to keep doing the work and keep you know, pulling back the layers of the onion. And by doing that and pulling back the layers of the onion, I heal more and more of myself, and the journey that I have inward towards me, towards loving me and being kind to me and not rejecting me and not abandoning me. You know, and it's very, very rare now that I get into any self-hatred, or you know, I don't have that self-rejection that I had, you know, where I didn't think I was enough. I can sort of say I'm beautiful today. You know, I'm an older woman, but I love my life, you know, and I've created a really beautiful life. I don't work so much anymore. Part of that, part of my CoDA journey has been coming here and changing my life so that I only work 6 months a year. I spend 6 months living in India on a beautiful beach. I teach a bit of yoga. You know, I have a really much calmer way of life, where I don't have so much being there for others, caretaking others. I'm with myself more. And I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful that I carried on coming, that I didn't choose when the work got difficult. You know, I always thought that there comes a point, and I know there was for me with CoDA, where I didn't believe that I'd get to this point. And I love that step 3 prayer where it talks about healing the deepest wounds, you know, because that abandonment wound was so present. and it was so part of my life, and I never thought I'd be free. I never thought I'd have enough power to walk away from a relationship where I wasn't happy. I didn't think I'd ever be that person. And you know, and when I did that last year, it was like I felt like it was my higher power saying, this is what happens, you know, the fruition of doing lots of work and going on the inner journey, making friends with my little girl, you know, being loving to myself, years of, you know, practicing self-care, talking to myself, battling with the inner critic, losing the inner critic, you know, and learning to love myself means that that wound heals, the wound closes up, and we get to be free, you know. And I never, when it says in the promises about being precious, unique, precious being in our promises, and that for me is, you know, I feel all the things that I hated about myself when I was growing up. You know, I've got a bit of a lump in my nose. You know, I've got a bit. My skin's quite wrinkly and quite old looking and quite dry. All these things that I abused myself for years because it made me feel not enough. I don't have that anymore. I don't have that thing when I look in the mirror where I just think you know, the self-hatred was dripping out of me when I came to this fellowship. And things have got better. You know, all my relationships have got better. I don't have lots of relationships anymore. I have a few relationships that are equal. I've allowed the love to come into my life, and that's really beautiful. You know, for many years I couldn't do that. My sabotaging behaviors in relationships have calmed down. I don't do the push and pull. I really check out my agenda of what's going on, you know. And I really, you know, the promises here came true for me, and I believe that anyone can have that in this program if you're willing to do the work. It's about the written work, it's about the inventory, and I do this practice every morning with my higher power, where I give my higher power my control. My control has been the most damaging feature of my codependency, and especially with my partner. You know, the more I have controlled her, the more the relationship you know, felt damaged, and the more I've let go and the more I just let her be, the more the relationship has flourished. So my control has been, you know, and I'm aware that when I'm tired, when I'm fearful, when I've got stuff going on, when my self-care drops, then I go back into these old caretaking, avoiding, controlling. So I really watch myself. If I keep the foundation of my recovery good with my self-care, I don't go back into those old behaviors.
Thank you.
Yeah, so when I started it, first of all, what I did was I got lots of pictures of myself as a little girl, and I started to I did a little collage. I did like a little arty collage of you know, what I imagined my life would have been like growing up, you know, and I did different ages of my inner child as well. So and how much it's changed now, you know. I never imagined that I couldn't I found that I couldn't actually connect with my inner child at the beginning. It was just it was like I couldn't go there. Actually, there was a really big block for me in the beginning, and it has changed. You know, it's easy for me to go there now and feel that connection, and feel her sadness and her grief, and you know, all of those things. But yeah, so I did a really lovely sort of collage book, which was really nice, which was different ages of inner child, like with the young pictures, and then me with my inner child as a sort of teenager, because I was quite a rebellious teenager. So I've traveled through those stages, and I can really experience in my life today when I'm feeling quite childlike, and my connection was with my behavior. Sometimes I can feel very rebellious and like my inner teenager's in control, you know. So I think there's connecting with my inner child of all different ages, which has been really good. but it's really changed. There's a massive connection for me, and now it's loving, and you know, now I've really got that sort of inner parent that I didn't have before. I do look after my little girl. I quite often cycle around London having little chats with her, and if I feel fearful or scared, I quite often talk to her out loud and try and work out what's going on. So yeah, the parenting of my little one has been a really big part of my recovery in the later years. I hope that answers your question. Yeah, so basically I knew it was going to be a really difficult conversation, but what had happened was that I'd been out the country and I'd had these dreams. I had these dreams of me doing it, and it was almost like it was so in my subconscious that it was almost, I felt like my little girl was channeling and saying, you have to have this conversation. You're at that point in your CoDA recovery now where you've done all this work, you see the truth of what's happened, and you have to stand up and say it wasn't okay, and you have to say it to the person that sort of did a lot of the damage. And I knew that there was a good chance it could go really badly, and there would be repercussions, and maybe even the relationship would break down. But I was sort of willing to take that risk, and I did a lot of journaling around it, and I talked to my CoDA step group. We were, I can't remember what step we were in, actually. I think it might have been a step 11. And I took a lot of time in prayer and meditation, and it wasn't something that I knew that I would do it when the time felt right. And I'd had 2 visits with her and it didn't feel right, and I left it. And then there was a lovely afternoon where we'd had a really good, because I just visit her in the daytime because she drinks in the evening, and then I get the train before she starts drinking, and we'd had a really nice relaxed day. There'd been no spikiness, and I just felt this is the time to talk about it. And when we did it, immediately she got defensive, and immediately I said, I'm not saying it to blame you. I really want you to know I'm not saying it to blame you. I'm just saying I want to stand up for little Amanda that didn't get for what she needed. And remarkably, there was like a moment of grace where she heard it. In that moment, she heard it, and she said, I'm so sorry. She said, you know, I was just doing what had been done to me. And I got it. You know, she had been brought up in a similar home. The children were seen and not heard. You know, she wasn't really part of, you know, the parents' lounge wasn't where she hung out. She lived in her bedroom. She had horses, and, you know, so, and actually after that conversation, I feel like there was more of a connection between us. It had the opposite effect. My fear told me that it would be rows, you know, maybe a ending of the relationship, and it wasn't. There was more of there was a connection of intimacy because I'd been brave enough to say it to her, and she heard that it wasn't done in a blaming way. I really wasn't doing it to blame. I was just doing it to say, you know, it did really affect me. That lack of love affected me, and she heard it, and I felt I felt afterwards, I felt really proud of myself for doing it. So, but I think it's a conversation that needs to be had when you feel that intuitively, it's intuitively the right moment. And it's not something I planned to do it on the first and second time, and it was like, no, it didn't feel right. So I really tuned into my gut. I did a little cloaking exercise before I go down on the train. I always do a little white light, protects myself from, because she can be quite vicious sometimes with some of her, how she says things. So I do a little visualization, a little protection before I go down, so that if she does, and I remember doing that, I do that each time I go down on the train anyway. Yeah, so I hope that helps. Yeah, I mean, I think the rage, that for me, the anger, and I used to do exactly the same. I'd have these dreams where I'd be really angry at my mum, going, don't you know what you did, you know? And it was almost, but what I had was the leakage from that, the leakage that would come into my everyday life, little silly little things, and my first reaction was anger. And now I understand that the more I did the inner child stuff, the more I was connecting with the sadness. And my anger was just a deflection because I couldn't manage myself in that sad place. So it was the connection, really, the connection to my past, the connection to what happened to me, the connection to my story, and the connection to my little girl. And the more I practiced going inwards and spending time with her and doing inner child visualizations, the more the sorrow was allowed to come out, because my rage was just me trying to swerve from the sadness, from the absolute grief and devastation that was under the rage. But it was almost like I had to get through the rage to get to the sadness underneath. And and I think what I know is all these behaviors come from something. I'm not a therapist or whatever, but I know I had to get to a certain point with that anger where I could really see it was always trying to mask me trying to get in contact with my emotions. I just couldn't. Anger was easy for me. Anger was an easy, but it was also, I think, a byproduct of this process, because there was no room for my anger as a little girl. I didn't have a right to be angry. I didn't have a voice. I didn't have a voice to say, this isn't okay. I don't feel loved here. So, and I think part of the piecing together of the CoDA journey is to reclaim that anger and say, this wasn't okay. What happened to me wasn't fair. What happened to me wasn't right. And so I think anger, if it's channeled in the right way, is really healthy, really healthy, because it's an emotion I was never allowed to have. I wasn't, there wasn't anyone listening, even if I could have had it. So I think it's a sign of healthy emotions bubbling to the surface. And I think the dreams about it is the beginning of you going to do it and letting it out. And it's much better that it's out rather than be. And I'm in menopause, and I've got to say, menopause has been beautiful because all the stuff has come out, which has been really healthy. It's felt like all of the stuff, all the trauma that was pushed down over the last 3, 4, 5 years has just come outwards, and I'm pleased for that. I don't know if the general public are pleased. I sort of a road rage on my bicycle and things, but it's helped me sort of get to a place where I can cry more, where I can feel sad, where I don't have to go to that defense mechanism which was my rage. Yeah, so it's I do it, it's like a meditation thing. When I normally meditate, I normally imagine a white light coming out the top of my head. So it's just imagining a white light coming down from my higher power and then just completely coating me. And I imagine myself in a little white bubble of light that is like a protective armor or a shield, just that it doesn't let anything damaging or hurtful in. And it's just a golden white light, and it just represents love and safety. And I do that like a little coat. So it's just, you can imagine that you're just zipping on this little coat of armor to look after myself. And that's what I do. As I go down on the train, every time I imagine, and just seeing it as like God's love or my higher power's love, just coating me, protecting me, and not to get in the ring to, with my mum, she's very verbally abusive, so just to not let that damage in anymore. After being a young girl of receiving so much, I just don't want to let that into my heart space anymore, that level of abuse. So by doing that little protection of that little white light, it just gives me some strength and armor to go down and just not let it just let it roll off the little protection system. Yeah, I mean, I used to do a lot, especially when I was any negative thoughts that would come in my head, I would always turn it into an affirmation. So early on in my CoDA journey, I used to do a lot of affirmations. And I think because the inner critic has sort of quietened down now, I use them less, because I naturally just have that sort of, they're naturally there, I don't have that voice anymore, but I did it a lot. If I get any fear around anything, I always turn the fear into an affirmation. So whether it's around work, relationships, anything that's going on, and when I get the fear, I'll just I'll just flip it into a positive affirmation. And I've learned to do that a lot, and that really helps me. Like the power of manifestation. If I'm feeling really nervous or fearful, as soon as I put that negative into the positive, and then it will call the universe or my higher power to bring it into a positive thing. So that's what I do. That's my regular affirmation practice of just anything where the fear comes up, I flip it into a positive affirmation. So normally I come back, I do seasonal work. I live in India for 6 months, and then normally what happens is I come back, and what I always say to myself, I always have a little bit of a like, oh, I wonder where I'm going to work this year. And then I always say, please, higher power, I know you're going to put me in the best job where you're going to make the most use of me, that I'm going to be a tool for you. And it's going to be, and I always work for charities. So it's going to be in a charity where I'm working with the most grateful, well, for the most best client group that's most suited to my skills and my assets. And I've got to say, every time I come home, I always get amazing jobs in amazing organizations. And I've done it around my health for years. I had a lot of liver issues. I had a lot of consequences of my addiction, and I've done a lot of affirming around my health. And I had a liver scan recently, and all my fibrosis, I had quite very high scarring of the liver. I was near cirrhosis, has almost disappeared. I'm down to like 4.5 on a FibroScan, which is like a healthy liver. And I think that's also just affirming I am healthy, my liver is well, my immune system's strong. So I do a lot of that. I've had long periods of, and I think that was tied in with the codependency of not being physically well. And the last few years, that's really shifted. So I do affirmations a lot around my health. I think the step work, being in a step group, and what was beautiful was being in this step group and really seeing in my group how codependency, I really learned how the codependence traits vary in each we're all very unique the way that we interpret our codependency. So what was lovely in the step group was that I got a really clear view. I had my insanity, and there were a few in the group that were very similar to me, very up on the caretaking and the controlling. But what was lovely is I also saw other versions of the codependent traits in the other people. So for me, the most helpful bit was being in a step group, writing the steps, talking the steps. We'd go away, we'd do our writing, and then we'd read our steps out to each other. And for me, what was beautiful that no one in that step group knew what they were doing. We didn't have a sponsor, and the miracle happened, and a year later, a lot of us had gone from enmeshed relationships to being really uncodependent. So it was beautiful. I think step group, is the most powerful. I've never gone back to working with a sponsor. I've stayed in a step group since I was 10 years clean, and to this day I'm with the same group of people, and we keep going with the steps, and it's been amazing. No, definitely not. I mean, I think it's really felt for me, sometimes CoDA recovery has felt like one step forward and 2 steps back. And understanding that part of my codependency is that I'm constantly that coming back. Control for me is my go-to. Control is always where I go. If I'm fearful, if things aren't going to plan, I will always come back to control. And that for me is my first sign of insanity, and reminding myself, especially around people, using the steps, coming back to the 1, 2, 3. I'm powerless over people. There's no point. I'm not going to be insane again. I'm acting insanely. So there isn't a point I feel like my relationship with myself massively changed through the CoDA work, but I will never be free of those defects because they're part of the codependency. And the re-emergence is just understanding that I've been triggered externally by something, and I go into the old coping mechanisms. And part of the CoDA journey is just realizing a little bit quicker, I'm back in it again. I'm trying to control a situation I have no control. I'm powerless. I don't want to be insane. I'm back in insanity, and then giving that to God, giving that person to God, and just handing it over in step 3. So if I practice that with my defects, then generally that works. But depending on, you know, sometimes my level of perfectionism or control can be really, really high, and that correlates with the level of fear in that situation. So the more I'm in my disease thinking with the codependency, the more I need to hand over to my higher power. But it's a massive part of, there is CoDA recovery is not linear. You know, recovery from addiction is linear. You stop whatever you're up to and you recover. CoDA isn't like that. There's a constant recycling of behaviors that come and go depending on, and it's part of the healing as well. I think that I become more aware of my external triggers, more aware of the things that put me into that trauma loop, that make me back in the control arena again, or back in the perfectionism, you know. So yeah, I hope that makes sense. So I think it's very hard when you're early and you're new in. I didn't really understand. Couldn't see the flags with toxic people. I just, you know, because of my codependency, I thought everybody was lovely like me. I thought everybody had a good agenda, and it's taken me many years to spot red flags in people and to understand. So I think it's quite early on, it's incredibly difficult to work out if you're being avoidant or you're being boundaried. What I know, the process for me with boundaries was that I couldn't do them. I found it really hard. And then when I did do them, I was very over enthusiastic with my boundaries. So my delivery wasn't good with the boundaries. I did walls. And then somewhere through that process, I came back to the middle of being able to set boundaries in a loving way. But I think it's not an easy thing when we've come in from a place of being very unboundaried and then having to start to say no to people. There's the guilt and the residual of protecting ourselves feels very strange in the beginning, but the more we do it, the more easily it happens. And then we start to learn about who is unhealthy, and we spot the people coming in. I always think we're like radiators. Codependents are like radiators, and what I had was a lot of drains that drains would seek me out to suck me dry of my, like a vampiric thing. And I've learned to spot people like that now. So yeah, I hope that makes sense. So I always start with have I eaten healthy today? That's a big part, because food, overeating is very much connected to my control and my perfectionism and my like a way of self-soothing. So yeah, I always think about, have I eaten healthily today? Have I exercised? To exercise is a really part of me discharging my emotions and releasing. I find that a lot of the time I'm in a shallow breathing state, quite hypervigilant, shoulders up. So when I exercise and I do shaking rituals and stuff to get rid of this armoring that comes from trauma, where the body's very tight up here, and then I do have I prayed, have I meditated? So those are always part of my inventory, just to keep me on the even keel. Then it'll be about my communication. Has my communication been healthy today? Which means, have I stood up for myself? Have I communicated in an assertive way? Have I not let any abuse in today? Then the next one is, have I lived God's will? And that's where my control comes in. Have I allowed the day to unfurl in the way? Have I been pushy, dominant, controlling? Have I acted out on any codependent behaviors, and if I have, what did I do and how do I feel about it now? I also include, have I had any diseased thinking within my relationship with my partner? Because through this process, you know, my inner critic moved to my outer critic, and a lot of the time I want to make my partner like she's not enough. So I've had to include that into my inventory, to not have to look at any disease thinking within my relationship, and not make her the problem, to blame her for the issues in the relationship. And then the other ones I do, I'm trying to think what else I do. Yeah, have I communicated, lived God's will? Have I been kind and loving to myself as well as others? Have I had love in my thoughts, words, and actions today towards myself and towards others? So that's normally what I do as a basic, and I just do it in a group with my step group. We do it every day. We do an inventory and a gratitude all in one. So we normally put 3 things we're grateful for as well. In the moment, what step 10, I mean, I normally try to work out what defects at play, you know, what am I doing here? What is real? What is real? What am I trying to avoid? And quite often with a person, it's going to be, do I need to say it to this person? Are they listening? And is the relationship worth it? So I found that finding my voice in CoDA was great, but a lot of the times I used my voice when I didn't really need to. So I really bring that in around the person, you know, are they going to hear it? Is it necessary? And is the relationship worth this conversation? So self-care and self-love is always the basics for me, making sure that I get enough sleep. Sleep's really important for me. Just making sure that I'm getting nourished on a soul level, that I'm around people that treat me beautifully, that reflect back who I am, that I'm around people that I can be intimate with, that I can have deep, lasting friendships or connections with, people that have known me years. Eating really well, trying to eat really healthy, fresh food, always exercising. Today I had a day off. Sunday's my only day off from exercising. I love exercise. Exercise is one of my sort of self-care things, that it just brings a lot of emotional freedom for me and a lot of releasing of stress. Daily, you know, weekly, regularly activities. I have full body acupuncture, I have massages, I do yoga. I'm a yoga teacher, so I teach quite a lot of yoga, but I do a lot of yoga for myself, regular inner child meditations, regular meetings. Since Zoom's kind of come about, you know, I do meetings very regularly. I enjoy meetings. I enjoy doing fun things as well. Part of my self-care is being very childlike, going dancing. There's a thing we have called ecstatic dance, which is just dancing to music, and you know, it's drug and alcohol free. So anything that's moving the body, I like to do regularly. Any stress releasing exercises as well. And having quiet time. I enjoy reading, sitting in the sun, practices that just calm me, you know. I've learned I have quite a sort of manic high energy, and I have to really take time out. So I have to really make sure on my weekly diary when I'm working that I really take time out. I maybe at the weekends I don't really answer the phone much. I'll only do booked in calls with people. So I'm very part of my self-care is that I'm very good around my time management, where I allow myself, I have time for me and my partner, I have time off from giving to anybody. I only have a certain amount of sponsees, and I only do scheduled fortnightly calls with step work only. So all these things that I build in, so that I have enough space for me really to wind down and give myself time off from giving, being there for others, trying to just turn up for myself more. You know, like someone else said, always those years of me always being last in the line really try and put myself first in the line, checking in with myself daily. What's going on? Am I feeling okay? And if I'm not okay, I maybe do some journaling. I maybe get onto a meeting and share, so constantly really just making sure that self-care is my precedent above everything else, even if it means I've got to cancel. I've done so much of cancelling people and things and events whilst being in CoDA, and that's most probably the most healthy thing. I'm an overextender and an overcommitter, and what I've learned to do over the last few years is I just don't do that anymore. But if I book things and I'm tired or I'm ill or I'm not good, I cancel, and I don't have any guilt about that.